Good afternoon, everyone. Today is February 25th, 2025. This is a City of Prescott City Council study session. I do want to make a point that we have several items on our agenda for this study session. So I'm going to restrict the amount of time we're going to discuss items B, C, and D to 25 minutes each. And then the original presentation on mid-year budget report will get 20 minutes. We've had a tendency to spend a lot of time on early agenda items and then not have enough time for some of the later ones that are really deserving of a decent amount of time to be considered. So we will start with roll call, please.
Mayor Good.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Cantelmi.
Here.
Councilwoman Freeworth.
Here.
Councilman Gambogi.
I am here.
Councilman Montoya.
Still here.
Councilman Moore.
Here.
And Councilmember Rusing.
Here.
All are present.
So item A, presentation and discussion regarding the fiscal year 2025 mid-year budget report.
Thank you, Mayor.
Woodville.
Oh,
Good to see you.
can everybody hear me? This is our annual mid-year budget report, which also kicks off our next year budgeting calendar. We have the mid-year budget summary, which is similar to the thing that council sees every other month in their updates from staff. We send you a budget report, but we'll go into a little more detail on this one as it's through the first 6 months of the year. But we'll also talk about concerns of the upcoming budget year. So we'll start with we'll call them challenges, I guess, considerations. We're concerned, again, with the legislative attacks on city revenue. We lost this year the rental tax, which was a big hit to both streets fund and the general fund. Food tax, it's makes us all nervous. It's a problem, then it's not a problem with amendments, and then there's a new amendment, it's a problem again, and now there's the potential for another amendment. Any loss in that would be significant. Obviously, it's about $10.4 million a year. 3.5 in the streets fund, 3.5 in general fund, and then 3.4 in that public safety tax fund, which the voters just approved if it were to go away. And as we look at the legislature's agenda, they also have other tax cut ideas and other things they're trying to get through. Whenever they do that, they put themselves in a financial bind and look at attacking our share of the state shared revenue. So that's always a concern. They can always take more of one of our revenue sources. So always something we want to keep an eye on. Continued funded employee market compensation, that's been an issue for the council for the last several years. Council has done a great job making sure that's included in the budget. It looks like this year we're going to get a little bit more of a break where the CPI, the cost of living, is only at 2.2%. So that reduces it from what we've seen over the last 5 years. The public safety expansions, the timing of those, the financing of those, the impact on those of losing residential rental tax and losing the food tax and that type of stuff will be considerations during the budget process. So want to keep that in mind and all their operational needs. Water and wastewater capital, we have a lot of capital like we do every year. It's putting a lot of pressure on our rates, as we saw from our rate study we did this last year. How do we fund that as we move forward? How do we fund that as some of the funding options, either through WIFA, through state regulations, are harder to get, or through federal, funding of those things are less beneficial to us in cost? Do we go to the regular debt market and do that, which is always an option for the city? But it will be some of the considerations as we go. The funding approach for fluctuations in unfunded pension liabilities in our PSPRS funds. And I talked about this last year, talked about we needed to have a policy change, and we're bringing one forward because we're going to have fluctuations in these pension liabilities. That's just the way pensions work as they final out. Tier 1 and Tier 2 have no new employees in them, so it's just existing employees. As long as they're still pensions, those things are going to fluctuate. So looking at our pension unfunded liability over the years, the city, as everybody knows, has done a great job. We've come from 86 million in debt, 86.5 million in debt, down to 3.5-ish, 3.6. But as you can see, the police pension has fluctuated up a little this year, which you're going to see. It's going to fluctuate up. It's going to fluctuate down. As we look at those, that's 942 this year. It fluctuated up. Those fluctuations are caused by actuarial assumption changes, which there were no significant ones this year, but they're also caused by real experience, actual experience being different than the assumptions in the actuarial, which is what we saw this year. It had, various reasons for the amount. Those aren't as significant as what are we going to do to make sure that we keep these things funded and we commit to what the council committed to, I guess, several years ago. Might have been the prior council, but in our pension funding policy, we committed to having a fully funded PSPRS pension by 2026, by June 30 of 2026. So to address this, staff's proposing that we add to our council pension funding policy that PSPRS participating departments, police, fire, sometimes regional dispatch, depending on who's supervising in there, with unfunded pension liabilities will deposit any unencumbered operating surpluses annually to their PSPRS trust until it is fully funded. Does that mean we'll be able to fully fund them this year? No, it means if the police budget is $500,000 below projected operating because of turnover or inability to fill positions or whatever, at the end of the year, we'll send that to the trust to help resolve these unfunded pension liabilities. It's, like I say, not guaranteeing that we're going to be able to pay it off immediately, but it's an approach that we can live with and move forward to make sure that we address these fluctuations. Some years after we get caught up, the trust could be in the surplus. And obviously in those years you wouldn't send money, but it is pretty good. The results this year of operations, looking at the actuarials, were not terrible. We had some discrepancy. Their earnings rates are finally down where they're being achieved. They have a actuarial earnings rate of 7.2 in their assumptions. They earned 10.2 in the year of the report, which is in 24. Even smoothing that, it almost hit the amount, which was 7.1. So, the pensions are doing good, the trusts are doing good. It's just we need to come up with an approach to keep these funded since the citizens voted in that tax to bring them down. Council made that commitment to get them paid to zero and moving forward.
Mark, I called PSPRS to try to investigate how that liability was starting to grow. And they said one of their assumptions is that salaries and benefits would grow approximately 2.3% per year. Well, you'll recall just a couple of years ago, we gave our police department a bigger raise to be competitive with other municipalities in the area. So because it was above that assumption, that generated additional liability going forward. So we have to keep that in mind sometimes when we are considering salaries and benefits to the department and what its impact would be on our future liability for PSPRS.
Yeah, and absolutely, and that was the reference that was in the actuarial report was that salary expenses, and they have a relatively complex, depending on the employee life, what they assume pay increases and that type of thing will be. But you're absolutely right, Mayor. So with that, if council is okay with this approach, and again, it's an approach I think as the budget finance director is a reasonable approach, is something that won't impact future operations and will actually help because it'll keep lowering that pension cost as we move into the future. If council's good with that, I will bring it back on the March 11th agenda.
Councilman Montoya has a question.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll try and be brief, Mark. I support the process of what you're describing. I think it's good fiscal policy, and I like that part of it. My only question is there a way to divorce this from the additional funding we've gotten from the new tax increase? Just because I think people are watchful of kind of some slow creep with that.
Absolutely, Councilman, and that was not my intent with this wording. This is the operational money, not the PSPRS specific.
The 478.
Yeah, the 478 specific.
Excellent. Then I'm completely on board.
And
just
I
wanted to double check that.
I can modify the wording a little to make that clearer in the policy when I bring it back.
Yeah, no, and I my assumption was as much, but I think we have enough people kind of watching to make sure that 478 money gets used for what its intended purpose is, that I think it's important and incumbent upon us to ask this question. So thank you for that clarity.
Sure.
Councilman Gambogi had a question.
I do. Mark, in your proposed addition to the current pension funding, the wording in red, where did the money go before if there was a surplus?
These surpluses, obviously, if they're not spent, they go into the next year budget process as one-time revenues, and they're used to buy capital assets that are needed, like replacement police cars and things like that. So yeah, this will impact the funds available for this while there is a liability. But again, the goal is to get that liability down to zero, and then it will not use up that whole available funding that's there.
Councilwoman Furworth.
Thank you, Mayor. I had a similar concern about P478, so I'm glad to hear about that. My other question is really, and I think Ted just hit on the beginning of what I was concerned about, is could we see how this would have played out over the last 2 or 3 fiscal years? Because my concern is it may change how staff has to operate if now they can't hire. We're having trouble recruiting. Then they figure, okay, that can roll over and become the new cars that we need. And if we start scraping all of this, it's going to change how they really plan over time. So I'm just trying to wrap my mind around what does this mean and what does this look like? So maybe it's the last 2 or 3 budget years. If we can just see you play that out, an example when you come back on March 11th,
Sure.
That would, I think, be helpful to us understanding and staff understanding how this is going to change. How we operate.
Right. And great point, and I can do that. And we will bring that back with the change on March 11th. And again, the deficits in the PSPRS are going to fluctuate. So I don't anticipate $1 million every year that we got to come up with. So, hopefully once we get to zero, they're little. They're, 100,000. They're a couple, they're just a marginal, so they don't use all that surplus, so there still is money available for cars.
Yeah, I understand. I was looking at the budget, which you're going to get into with some of the details, and here we are halfway through the year, significantly underspent in some areas. So this is what gets me concerned if we change the policy and people don't operationalize it differently.
Okay,
Thank
I'll
you.
bring that back with the policy.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Mark, when they, back with the 443, the passing of the 443, I remember seeing a lot of data with the Tier 1 and Tier 2. Was it 20 or 30 years before that, from the date of the 443, when we still owed the 80-something million? Was it 30 years to turn over, and then the Tier 1 and Tier 2 would be mostly gone? Is that right?
No.
Okay.
They had an amortization period of the unfunded liability of 20 or 30 years, choice of the trust board for that particular trust. The city of Prescott left ours at 20, and that was to amortize the unfunded liability to get it collected. The pensions will last, I believe, 2015, I think, might have been the last time an employee went into tier 2. So if they were 20 at that time,
We're getting
100 years from then, or 80
Yeah.
years from then. So the tiers will be around for a long time. But what I believe the date you're remembering is the amortization of the unfunded liability date.
One last question on that. I remember when Mayor
Mark
Ober.
only has 5 more minutes, so let's try to wrap it up.
Okay. Do you know if the board or the wealth management team, have they cut their fee at all? Because I remember at one time, weren't they taking 60%?
That was only on certain investments that were in place, and the PSPRS investment board has been working to finalize those contracts and move on to more appropriately structured investments.
Thank you.
All right, so with that, I'll bring it back, and I'm going to start going a little quicker. This is the taxable activity for the first 6 months of the fiscal year as compared to the 3 years prior. As you can see, we're about flat this year, up maybe just about 0.5%, which is expected. Things are slower across the nation. I mean, obviously, the increases in the prior years were partially spurred by inflation. Bed tax collection are significantly down. They're down 3%, not a big concern. We have talked during the budget process for the last 2 or 3 years that more realistic, with given the inventory that's available, is bed tax collection about 1.5, which is what we've been budgeting, what we've been trying to live within in that fund. So it's not great, but it's not a super big concern. I wanted to put these in here just to remind the council, where does the funding for the general fund, which is mostly public safety and other life enhancing services that we do, like recreation, library, and those, come from? And again, 47% comes from our local 1% tax, and almost as much, 42%, comes from state shared revenues, which are distributed based on population compared to population in other cities in the state. And then property tax franchise and a few others like interest. Where does it go? Again, here we go. We got 69%, 69.5% for public safety, and then the other various departments that are out there. This is the year-to-date budget for the fiscal 25 budget. Again, operational budget is at 44% spent overall. A lot of that is based on the timing of certain operational expenses, service contracts, significant subscription renewals, things like that. Capital budget is at 16, which is pretty much common at this point. We do it as fast as we can do it. If the capital budget is more, if it doesn't happen this year, it just gets pushed to the next year. So it's not like it doesn't happen. Looking through the revenues, wanted to just spend a little more time on this. As you can see, tax revenues are at about level, which is what we saw from the sales tax report. So even though tax growth is down, it is about right where we projected it to be, which was flat this year. So those are coming in as expected. Intergovernmental revenues are in good shape. Slightly lower. Again, that has to do with the fluctuations in our share of state sales tax. Licensing and permits are up. Again, relatively small. Charges for services are up. A lot of that has to do with increased building activity, inspection services, increased impact fees, increased water rates based on the water rate study that was adopted this year, those type of things.
Councilman Gambogi, you have a question?
I'm sorry, I forgot to take my light
Please
off.
continue, Mark.
Okay, investment income is up significantly this year. We've seen some challenges with that in the zero interest rate world because we cannot be risky. Our investments are in very safe assets, U.S. Treasuries, money markets invested in U.S. Treasuries, those type of things. This year we are doing pretty good. We're up significantly there. Miscellaneous revenues are up. The reason they have a spike like you see here is because we finally received another payment on the 2019 snowstorm expense. Believe it or not, no money for recovery of those type of things is very slow money. And it takes hundreds of hours of staff time to keep fighting with these people. Internal service are right where we expect them to be. And again, the non-operating revenues, they're one time, they're not operational, they're various grants and other things are coming in about where we expect. Expenses, as Councilwoman Furworth pointed out, a lot of expenses are below the 50%. Part of that is just timing of the year. The first 6 months are always a little slower. Without the hard close of the fiscal year, a lot of the accruals don't really get made half year, but everything's looking good. Some of the departments that look significantly lower, like community development, are related to the fact that CDBG is in there, and CDBG funds have not been distributed yet this year, only a small portion of them. If those had been distributed, community development would be about 47% spent, which is about where you'd expect to see it. So we go down the list. Again, everybody looked real good. Nobody really stood out. The non-departmental are contingencies for operating, for grants and other things. Non-operating expenditures, again, are the capital and other things out there. We have the public safety capital that was passed by the tax that just went through. Those things really haven't been spent yet. There's a lot of time to get moving on those. And again, the non-operating expenses, if they're not done this year, they get pushed to the next year. It's not like they go away. It's just we need to have their appropriation if we're able to get traction on some of these capital projects. With that, I wanted to go over relatively quickly. These printouts that we have here actually came right out of our new OpenGov forms that will be available on the network for the public and for the council on a regular basis. Those are just cut and paste of those forms. Our budget process this year is well underway. Obviously, the red here represents public meetings. This one there is the first one. The next one from here till April 24th, we have significant meetings with the manager to kind of finalize this budget, structure this budget, and get it together. On April 24th, the OpenGov platform will be launched with the proposed 26 budget available to the public and to the council. And this is what the public and the council will use to review the budget. They'll be able to go through the departments. They'll be able to look at the capital projects forms. They'll be able to email us questions on what they are, what they mean, how they, all the details. They'll have access to the forums and everything. So the information will be out there. So our budget meetings this year, which is on Friday, May 16th, will focus more on the overall budget and how that achieves the council's strategic plan and what that means going forward, as opposed to a 4-hour march through line item by line item like our budget meetings have been in the past. We're trying to make it more productive to talk about the strategic plan and how it's meeting the council's goals. And then we go to tentative adoption and publishing and all that through June, and final adoption, and then the property tax is anticipated to be set on July 8th. Did I make it, Mayor? Oh, 3 minutes too long. Sorry. That's the end of my presentation, if there's any more questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate your trying to keep on schedule here. We probably should have told you in advance that you had 20 minutes.
Yeah.
But sometimes we get questions that get a little off point. So thank you very much.
Sure.
All right, in that case, we'll move to item B. So presentation, discussion, and direction relating to ingress and egress requirements. And we've got 20 to 22 minutes for that.
22, okay. I will do my best, Mayor. Mayor and Council Holger, Fire Chief, I'm here along with some other department directors to respond to a request for a little bit more clarification around ingress and egress requirements, road widths when it relates to developments. And we'll get right into that. First of all, Mayor Pro Tem can tell me, unfortunately, I did not have a chance to put that video in here, so I just wanted to preempt that for you. But let's get started. So first of all, the question came up is how are road widths in the city of Prescott determined? And there's actually a multitude of regulations that that influence that. A lot of times the fire code is seen as the primary guiding document for that, but that's actually not true. And there's a couple of reasons for that we'll discuss today. And there's other standards, including the Land Development Code, General Engineering Standards, and Regional Transportation Plans that actually influence how all those things play a role and connect together. The fire code is very specific. It focuses primarily on one purpose, and that is to get a fire truck or a complement of fire trucks to the scene of one structure fire. And it's interesting because that even applies into the Wildland Urban Interface Code, which may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but understand that the International Code series is connected. So the International Fire Code connects to the Building Code, connects to the Mechanical Code. And those are all structure-based codes, so even the Wildland Urban Interface Code at its heart is a structure-based code rather than a land management code. It does not address evacuation or competing traffic flows. So for instance, some of the situations we saw in LA and in Altadena of residents evacuating while fire trucks are coming in, that's not what the fire code is written for. That's where the other general engineering standards and land development codes come in. It does set minimum widths in the fire code, and that's generally no less than 20 feet and up to 26 feet for specific situations. And those specific situations are really twofold. Number one is if there's hydrants in an area, we need to be able to lay a supply line, which obviously requires a wider width, or if aerial apparatus, in other words, those big ladder trucks are needed. In those cases, we also need a little bit more width because those trucks come with outriggers and have wider turning radiuses. It also sets secondary access requirements, and that basically is required, again, for fire department access, not for evacuation. So in the fire code, while yes, it is true that depending on the size of the development or the width between entrance points, there is the need for secondary and even tertiary access. That is access for fire department apparatus, not evacuation. In the Wildland Urban Interface Code, as I mentioned, it also does not address more global land development. It's really single structure focus. And those may exceed, in our case, typical single structure fire standards. So what I mean by that is the building materials, the exterior siding, some of the roofing materials, those are what's called out in the Wildland Urban Interface Code, and even vegetation management. But again, those road width requirements are basically applied in concert with the fire code, and they are, in essence, the identical requirements. The other piece of it is, of course, there's no factors necessarily for that evacuation, but wildland fire, as we know, requires significantly more equipment and is also a lot more dynamic. And with that, I'm going to ask Chelsea Walton to come up and talk about the Land Development Code.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. So the Land Development Code obviously governs the design of new developments. So what Holger mentioned about the fire code relates to when plans and construction is moving forward. Land Development Code is typically what people reference when they are looking to develop a new subdivision or any kind of new larger project. So it also establishes general road layout requirements, balances public safety, mobility, emergency response, and it does try to incorporate all of the other requirements mentioned in the fire code as well as the general engineering standards. We try to make sure that there's good collaboration between the codes. And with the upcoming fiscal year, I am proposing a land development overhaul where we would look at some of the recommendations that the fire chief had later on in the presentation that will work well with that proposal. So in addition to what the code does itself is looks at outside codes. So from a planning perspective, we're always looking at connectivity, and we use the regional transportation plans that SIMPO provides, as well as our overall master plans throughout the city, as well as our general plans. So we do take a look at that when the projects come in at that initial development phase. So with that, I think Ian is up next, or Gwen, as far as the general engineering standards. Any questions for me right yet?
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. I live in a subdivision with 20-foot wide streets, and it's not very practical, to say the least. Two cars can barely pass each other. And then we have pedestrians walking dogs on the road. We have construction vehicles parked along the streets. On snow days, I have to back down hills to let traffic pass. So is there any movement to look at increasing this 20, or just getting rid of the 20-foot width?
Yeah, I think the conversation is kind of leading up to some staff recommendations as far as what we can do. And yeah, a lot of history in Prescott, a lot of narrow roads with this being one of the oldest towns. So I'll turn it over to Gwen, and then we'll wrap up with some of those recommendations.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem, did you want to ask your question now?
Well, I think actually I'll wait till Gwen, because I know they're going to be bringing some changes forward, which will help a lot. But at the end, after you're done, I'll ask some questions. Thank you.
Okay, so the general engineering standards, that's really the how do you build a road, right? What's the base material? How deep is it? What kind of weight, what kind of vehicles are going to drive on that particular road? But also in the general engineering standards, we look at what our street cross sections will be, and those are based on levels of traffic in a particular area. So for example, a local roadway street section is 28 feet of pavement within a 50-foot right-of-way, typically with sidewalk on one side of the street. That's the way our code is written right now. But when you get into major collectors or minor collectors or arterial roads, that street cross-section can look different. It can have sidewalks on both sides. It can have multi-use paths, things like that. And it can also have multi-lane configurations. So those are the kind of things that we look at from the general engineering standards, which is not, do we need a road, where do we need a road, but how do we build the road? That's the premise of the general engineering standards.
Well, Gwen, I will comment on the fact that I've been doing a little bit of research on this because we have some new developments in the general area that are asking for road widths that are substantially below 26 feet, much less 28 feet. We also had a insurance broker that made a presentation to the Men's Forum, and this is one of the more liberal insurance companies. From a couple of people I talked to, they said this insurance company is a little more likely to be able to write a new homeowner's policy. And they said they wouldn't write one for any home fronting a road that's less than 26 feet. So I think it's important that the community understand that we're considered a high-risk zip code. So 86305 is considered high risk regardless of whether they're over in Hokagon in the county or across the street in the city. So I know there's some Wildcat subdivisions over there. You're lucky to get one fire truck down some of those roads. So I think it's really important that people who have current homeowners and expect to be able to get renewed, or new residents that are moving into some of the areas, that understand that being able to get a homeowner's policy is going to be very, very difficult if they have a very narrow road. So I know, talking to the chief, he was saying our new fire trucks are about 7.5 feet wide. And if they do have a hydrant, they need about 6 feet clearance from the hydrant to the pumper function of the truck. So if you've got two fire trucks that respond to a residential fire, you got 7.5 plus 7.5 plus 6, you're already at 21. And that's assuming that you have perfectly parked trucks. That never happens either.
No.
So that's why I think 28 feet is a much more reasonable width. And I know the county standards, I think, are 30. So I think it's important that those standards be established and that residents are aware of them so that they have the ability to either get or maintain homeowners insurance. Member Rusing?
Thank you. I'm somewhat aghast that we just heard from 3 speakers and no one's going to, you just said we're not going to address evacuation and secondary egress and ingress. When are we going to, when are we going to look at that?
I think the fire chief is going to address that. Yeah, I don't,
When?
he's coming back up, right?
Very
Because-
soon.
Yeah.
Because I live in an area where if there's one way in and one way out, and if that way is blocked, we have no way to get out. And there's supposed to be a secondary access, a dirt road, and that's inaccessible for us. So I think in this day and age, especially looking at the fire season that's coming up, I think it's time that we make this a priority and start a conversation about evacuation routes and getting some secondary access in our older subdivisions and also prevent this tragedies from happening in future subdivisions.
Yep.
Thank you.
No, it's a perfect lead in actually to the next slide. One thing before I go on to that, though, I do want to mention.
I'm out of question.
Go ahead.
Do you want to ask the chief or Gwen?
You know, I wanted to kind of actually now piggyback on what Kathy said. The reason that I had brought this forward was because of, you know, I think we were all glued to the television when we could see everything unfolding in California. One of the videos I wanted to have shown today it's on YouTube. It's about that big bulldozer, if everybody remembers that, moving those cars out of the way so that we could get firefighting services up those roads. You know, and living in Prescott here for a long time, I never could understand why it was not mandatory that every development have a second way in for these services. So today I really did want to kind of get the ball rolling to make an amendment or a change to the land development code to do exactly what we're doing. A minimum of 28, maximum 30 feet going forward. So you can help us do that. And if you can talk to us about the process, that'd be great. Thank
Sounds
you.
great. So yes, before I go on to that slide, I want to just call out that last bullet was amended. Initially in your materials, it said at 28 feet without exception. We amended that because there have been exceptions in the past. And so we just want to call that out so that we're representing this accurately. But let's get into actually Councilmember Rusing's question and sort of where do we go from here? So up until now, we wanted just to kind of give you the background as to what regulations come together and play together to have road widths regulated and prescribed in the city of Prescott. And these are really the 4 main documents that do that. One key item before I go on to the next slide is they all have to work together. So for instance, the fire code, when I'm talking about 20 feet, usually we don't see that applied, and now you know why. It's because in those land development code and general engineering standards, we can't go below 28 feet on a public road. The fire code calls that a fire apparatus access road. And by definition, that starts at the apron of the fire station and all the way to the private property of the structure that you're building. And so the fire code actually has the ability to say on your private property, we need 20 feet in your condominium complex at a minimum. And so while of course our city attorney can explain that a little bit better, that's basically an easement right that we have, you know, the ability to even write a ticket on. And so that's why we don't apply that necessarily on roads, because the demand of a road, because of the volume for just normal traffic flow, is far further than 20 feet. And that's why you don't see the fire code getting applied on, you know, Montezuma Street, so to speak. But let's get into a couple of the things that we've been talking about in response to the request for this work session. So obviously, regional transportation plans should be consulted. And the reason for that is the evacuation component of this. If we make evacuation assumptions on a collector street or a feeder street in the city of Prescott, we need to make sure that, for instance, Highway 89 can accommodate that traffic. So that's a more global recommendation. The other piece, of course, is that we want to make sure that we look at risk in the community. One key component that is actually a really good timing of this is the new code adoption is just starting to get kicked off. And that means all the codes, as they connect together, are getting reviewed. And when we do that, my recommendation is that we look at, for instance, Copper Basin differently than we might, let's say, north by the airport. They both have wildfire risk, but the wildfire risk and particularly the evacuation needs in those areas are different. One is brand brand new. We get to plat those roads. They're getting built, in 2025. Copper Basin, as we mentioned, wildcat developments. We have to basically, do with what we got. And so the approach has to be a little bit different, and the codes have to be written in such a way that they can be applied effectively in those areas.
Councilwoman Furworth.
Thank you, Mayor. I think I understand because I did catch the fact that what you had on the didn't match, and I was like, amen to the word no exceptions. So you removed it because we have in the past, but the intention going forward is no exceptions, especially in large development agreement pad negotiations, correct?
Correct. And that is
Thank you.
really where your body comes in to direct staff on policy. So the other piece of this too is that really we need to understand the limitations of each one of the standards. So for instance, you don't want to apply the fire code where the land development code is the primary law of the land, and you don't want to apply the land development code where it should be a fire code conversation. And of course, that's why you have staff. We can help you through that and make sure that we're putting the regulations in the right place.
Councilmember Rusing, you had a question?
Yes. Currently, there's different standards for private roads and private subdivisions, and I think that should be eliminated. I think like you said, no exceptions. I think this is a public safety issue, and the developers need to understand that.
Mm-hmm. And Gwen, I don't know if you can address that point a little bit better.
Well, I've only been here 20 years, but in the 20 years I've been here, all private roads are built to public standards. There's no exception for a private road to be built to a different standard. So they are built to whatever the standard is, but to Chief's point, in the past, they've granted exceptions to that. So I'm sure they have done that for private roads as well.
All right. So the other components here, and this is really important, long-term maintenance. So for instance, secondary access points are often granted and they look great in the moment, but then 20 years later when, somebody has forgotten that plat review, the maintenance sometimes can get challenging and the access or even the egress can also fall fallow. And there's also policies that we can implement that can help with that. Emergency management is huge in this. Public participation, knowledge, awareness is a key component of all of this. We are just about to debut a new product called Genesis along with our public notification software, Rave. And as part of that, the primary purpose of that software is emergency evacuation. And the entire city has already been broken up into zones, and it considers the factors that we've talked about. Copper Basin is much more congested, constrained, whereas we have different requirements in Deepwell Ranch. And so those are things that are going to really be a key piece. People being aware of where they live, knowing how to get out, understanding those instructions, and renewing that on a constant basis is key for us as a public safety entity to make sure that they're properly accessing those services and they know exactly where to get the information in an emergency. And then finally, and this is probably the bullet I think that you mentioned, Councilwoman Rusing, is exploring additional options for improving Ingress and Egress. What do we do in existing conditions? What do we do with new developments? And what would that look like? And this work session is really the kickoff to that conversation. And like I said, the timing is great simply because we are right at the beginning of our code adoption. So a couple of potential actions for us to review and update the land development code and make sure, as I mentioned, that there's consistency between those codes to influence future projects. Looking at potential fire code amendments, I would not recommend too much application of the fire code beyond what its scope is, which is really, on that private single structure development, but to look at the other codes for influencing road widths and especially emergency evacuation. We are continuing to work on enhanced emergency management planning. Our new fire marshal has that now in his area, and we're also discussing with the county how we can better collaborate and utilize those resources. And then finally, once again, every opportunity that we can take to improve Ingress and Egress, especially on the maintenance side, is also a really important aspect. So with that, we really are looking to you for any questions that you have that we haven't already answered. And this is just a recap again, that this is a system of codes that has to be properly applied in order to be effective as much as possible. And we definitely would appreciate any of your input and direction on any of these items.
Councilwoman Furworth.
Thank you, Mayor. As you're looking at input, I'm all for no exceptions. Everybody gets an ingress and an egress, all those kind of things. But the other one that I've heard from, and it's come up a couple times in various workforce housing discussions, is how do we go about engaging members of the community to be part of this renewal work? And the community I'm talking about are builders. If we want to ever get to any kind of workforce or affordable housing, are all of our codes necessary in all parts of town? Are there places in town that we could do with less because the risk of fire or earthquake or whatever, flooding is less? And so I'm just interested in having you from a policy standpoint to maybe have some various focus groups that you can work that represent different parts of the community to get their input now rather than their frustrations with us later. Thank you.
I'll give you a quick appetizer and then ask Chelsea to address that point more comprehensively. So on the WUI code side, our new fire marshal has recommended, and I fully agree, that the WUI map that we have really needs to go away because the entire city, the entire county is in the wildland interface. But in the code, there's also, in that WUI code, there's a way for us to apply exactly what you just said, a risk-based construction. Rather than a one-size-fits-all approach, we're going to build a home different for WUI resistance up north than we do here in the downtown area, and applying that is something that we're working on, but I think Chelsea probably has a better answer on the overall code set.
Hi again. Yes, so the focus of the Land Development Code update will be to incorporate those various areas and applications that might be unique in different part of town. So kind of similar to what Holger does with the WUI code. Obviously, one size doesn't fit all when it comes to egress and the risk levels in the various parts of the community. So as far as the Land Development Code is concerned, we'll be working hand in hand with fire as well as our public works team with the general engineering standards, making sure that the codes are collaborative again and referencing which code is appropriate for which area. But from an overall development standpoint, yeah, it's our code is typically hit first when it comes to someone coming in and wanting to design, and placement matters. Geographical location of where the project is happening matters. And I don't disagree with the focus group. I made a note and definitely want to be able to receive input from those communities that have those issues. But as far as
We're
existing...
running a little long here.
Okay,
do you
so-
have one more question, Council Mayor Pro Tem?
Well, I think that Chief Holger was asking for some direction, and I'd like to just propose that we look into either an amendment or an addition to the Land Development Code that is a requirement for a secondary ingress, egress, as well as, and again with no exception, and then a width number attached, 28 to 30 feet, no exception, in the size of the road. So how we get to there, I don't know. You guys will have to figure that out, but I'd like to have that direction for the record. Thank you.
Well, I certainly agree with that too. Do we have a public comment, City Clerk?
We do not, Mayor.
Okay.
I don't have any public comment cards.
Okay, very good. Then thank you for your presentation, and we'll move on to item B. And item C.
Item C.
Yeah. Which is a presentation, discussion, and direction regarding loud vehicles and noise restrictions.
I think I will just start that off real quick. This is another issue I brought forward. We've had, I don't know if all the other council members have had, but I've had consistent complaints about this problem for years and years, and it's the noise ordinance. Why? The questions are always, why don't we enforce it? Anybody who's spent any time downtown during the summer at the concert series or walking around, and we have this constant issue with these loud cars and motorcycles circling the square over and over again. I was just down there for that protest. It was going on. According to our city attorney here, there is a state law that says that these altered mufflers are illegal. And so I would like to be able to have anybody that wants to speak about this come forward. I do happen to live in the downtown area. I don't live in a gated community, so it's affected us, off and on for me for almost 20 years. So I was very happy to be able to bring this together with a neighborhood group that I've been a part of for years, and put together some of the people that have also complained to me. So I'm not sure what we can do about this going forward, but now that we have the 478 money, which has been, brought up to me several times, because I know in many people calling the police department, the response has been, we have bigger fish to fry, and I will agree with that. They do. But I think as we move forward and we start to enforce or build up our police force, maybe we'll have some time to do some of this community or neighborhood policing. It has become a big problem, especially if we have the noise ordinance and the backup of the fact that these altered mufflers are illegal. I'd like to suggest that we do a sting and maybe do it for 1 week consistent. The city needs to put out some kind of a word over and over again to give them some warning that we're going to start enforcing this, so that maybe they will comply on their own. But I would like to see this be the beginning of doing something about the noise in our town. Willow Creek's another bad area. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So this item was brought by Mayor Pro Tem and Councilwoman Fruworth, and staff is looking for direction from the council on what action you'd like us to take on this, if any. I know Joe's got a few comments prepared. Deputy Chief Prembill is here with some comments if you've got questions. But the question from staff is, this is an issue that's been brought by the council, and we're looking for direction on how you'd like us to move forward, or if this is something you'd like us to focus on.
Well, I would like to understand our legal environment here. And then also I hear from Deputy Chief Brambilla regarding the ability to even measure, detain, and enforce. Sometimes that can be a rather difficult challenge. City Attorney Young?
Yeah, so under our city code, we do have restrictions on noise, but it's not really an appropriate vehicle to manage these loud cars and motorcycles because, and I'll just read the language, it's unreasonably loud and disturbing noise defined as such character, intensity, or duration as to be detrimental to the life or health or well-being of any individual. It's hard to prove that, and it's not defined. So under our city code, there's room to move that, and we've discussed this previously and kind of don't know where we want to go, but it's tough to deal with vehicles. Now, there is, under state law, as I mentioned, prohibitions on any muffler bypass or cutout that causes noise. And so in that case, it just takes kind of boots on the ground to check and see if there are these types of muffler cutouts or bypasses, or a removal of the muffler, because muffler is required under state law. That's for regular cars. Motorcycles have additional restrictions under our state law that they have to be under a certain decibel range. And so that is set by federal statute. So the state statute refers to the federal Code of Federal Regulations. And under the federal regulations, a motorcycle has to be brought below 80 decibel, which is pretty extensive. It has to be tested from 25 or 24.6 to 49.2 feet from the source of the noise. So it has under the federal regulations, there's a whole testing requirement. But yes, it's 80 under federal law, which was adopted by our state law, so we can enforce that. But I think that as it relates to, and I know PD will address this in a minute, but some direction on what council wants to see there, and whether that noise that's set in our state statute is appropriate, or we should be considering something different.
Councilmember Rusing, you had a question.
Oh, I've been spending a lot of time downtown on the courthouse square, and believe me, it sounds like the Indianapolis 500 racetrack down there. Sometimes you can't even hear yourself talk. I think some of these loud cars are taking advantage of, I think, a loophole. We really need to tighten up our city ordinance, and we need to have some sort of measurement that will hold up in court, like a decibel gun or something, so that when we go to court, we have evidence that that we can enforce.
Well, I think that leads directly to you, Deputy Chief. What are your comments on that?
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. John Brambilla, Deputy Chief, Prescott Police Department. I appreciate the comments from the Mayor Pro Tem. We do. I mean, we take an abundance of complaints as well, and we do assign. I have Lieutenant Small here who oversees our community service section as well as our traffic safety section. So we have spent considerable hours when we do receive complaints from neighborhoods to go out and do sound studies to see if there is unreasonable sound, things that we can take action on, right? And I think one of the things that we always try to do is first educate and then enforce, right? So those are the things that we try to do. Working within the city code, as our city attorney stated, it's pretty subjective when it talks about the unreasonable noise. So difficult thing for us to prove in court without a whole lot of evidence and spending a lot of time on it. Not that we don't want to assign people to it. We do have to prioritize life safety over, the way that we expect our community to be, and things that are, like you all mentioned, the downtown noise, right? So it is more of a living situation than it is a safety thing. So we do prioritize safety, but not that this isn't a problem. And we've looked at a couple of different ways to enforce that. We do have the state statute, and we've gone out and we've done an enforcement detail where we ended up citing, I believe, 10 different motor vehicles for the state code and issued some warnings to essentially for the equipment violations for them to fix their mufflers. So we have taken some enforcement action there. It does take some time, as we talked about the distances and decibel readings and things like that. But something more definite in our city code would probably help us with that. We've also looked at some pilot programs that are out across the country. Similar to photo red light, there are some systems out there that measure loud vehicles and can do enforcement through photo radar, red light, right? So we've looked at those, and there's some problems with them, but we continue to look at different options that we have because it is a problem within the community, and we want to be able to address it.
So can you envision some type of a process where a patrol officer has a decibel gun, for example, points it at a vehicle or a motorcycle and gets a reading that indicates excessive noise? Now he's got to jump in his patrol car and try to catch that person. And then if he finds him, he says, okay, I'm going to measure this from 26 feet away. And while he's measuring it, the motorcycle guy takes off. So there's a lot of challenges there.
There are
see if I can just kind of visualize how this would work.
There are some challenges with that, Mayor, and I know in the 26 years I've been doing law enforcement, technology really has come a long way. So it is possible that could be something that we could do eventually, but it does pose some challenges. And working the streets many years ago and pulling vehicles over for loud exhausts. Typically, we try to, again, educate, so it's a warning to get the exhaust fixed. But, it does get to an enforcement level at some point. If it's a problem in a neighborhood of loud vehicles, that's something else that we need to address. And it takes time, right? It takes effort from our officers to be out there to actually hear the violation, to gather the evidence that we need, to then go forward with prosecution through our city prosecutor's office. So there's quite a few challenges, but we're more than agreeable to look at the different options that we have to help us with that.
Well, I think Mayor Pro Tem's idea about having maybe a saturation event and being able to do it on a weekend or something like that, and catch the ones that are doing it frequently, and then maybe letting them know that there's a new sheriff or a new police officer in town.
And we did that with the traffic safety section. Mayor, we did spend, and Lieutenant Small was part of that, we did do essentially like a task force or a saturation patrol where our traffic safety officers or our motorcycle officers went out and they did issue citations and warnings for the state code.
Councilman Montoya?
Thank you, Mayor. Chief, I guess my question for you is, in terms of problems that the police department is dealing with in terms of enforcement of issues, where would you put this issue in a ranking of like the top 5 or 10?
Well, like I said, Councilman Montoya, we prioritize safety first,
Sure.
right? But the quality of life in Prescott is important as well because, I was born and raised here. Lieutenant Small was born and raised here. We want the quality of life to be an important part of that as well. I think it does come down to staffing, that once we can get our staffing up to where we need it to be, the traffic safety section needs to be staffed with more officers so that they can be out there. If I were to rank it in a top 5, I'd say it'd have to be 5, okay. Right? Because there are some other things that we focus on that do have to do with safety.
Let me rephrase my question then. What are things that you think are more important than this is right now that we're not getting enough attention to?
So obviously, any of the crimes that that are involving victims, right, and our serious felony crimes are important. And then when it comes to safety, it's reducing accidents, looking at places where we have accidents and what we can do to reduce those. And again, through education, engineering, working with public works, and then enforcement. Those are the things that are really the priority, is to make sure people are safe. Right, looking at our bicycle lanes, looking at sidewalks and things like that to make sure that the safety of the community comes first.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I guess for me, I probably am not spending as much time downtown as some other people, but I do have an office on Willow Creek Road, and I hear lights and sirens running down that road all day long. And primarily they're responding to accidents.
Correct.
And so I think one of the things that happened when Mayor Good got elected was he pushed for increased traffic enforcement.
Yes.
I think we've seen good returns on that. I think I'm not opposed to making sure people with illegal mufflers are getting enforced. I just want to make sure we've covered all of our bases with public safety first. So thank you for that.
Yes, and we would. And it's not a new problem. We've seen this noise problem in a lot of different ways, especially when it comes from the downtown area. Outdoor concerts that, the way that the downtown area is shaped, the acoustics down there are very challenging. And it's in one place you get a reading and then you go somewhere else and it's a completely different reading because of the way that sound travels in that downtown area. So I think that contributes to it a lot. I know that when our vehicles are going code 3 through downtown and it's reverberating off of the buildings, it's loud, right? It gets real loud. And same thing with the mufflers, it gets loud. So differentiating that with the ones that are actually violating the law, that's where a little bit of the challenge comes in for us.
And I think with the staffing being improved pretty significantly in the last few months, I review all of the citation reports with the chief at least every quarter. And I know in January when we had more traffic officers out there, the number of citations for civil and criminal speed was up well over 100%.
Yes, sir.
And I think as more people in the community realize that, gee, I just might get a ticket. Maybe I should slow down. More of that thought process will be generated.
Yes, sir.
Councilmember Rusing?
Thank you. I have 2 comments. Number 1, is this something that the citizens on patrol this could be delegated to them so that a uniformed police officer isn't tied up with this?
It's a great question, and obviously we like to use our volunteers where they can help out the sworn staff. Something like this, Councilmember Rusing, it wouldn't. They don't have enforcement capabilities, so it really wouldn't help. Other than their eyes and ears for us out on the street, and they could hear or see something and then call an officer over to deal with it.
Okay, and then I also like to comment in our code 5-4-2, item C, it only talks about tires, squealing tires, and I think that definitely we need to update that so that it would be easier to enforce in a court of law.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Yeah, real quickly, I just want to be able to weigh into this on this again if you need some direction. This is what I'm going to propose. I mean, ignore it if you want. But basically, a city code change. I think we need to have that specifically about the muffler alteration. I'm not a car person. I don't know a car that's that loud that hasn't been altered. Maybe they make them. I'm not sure. I do think we need to establish a decibel. And for the legal department, the strictest verbiage possible. Can we look into the noise detection system and see what that costs? And, it really is a quality of life issue down there. I do think, again, number 4, we need to do a citywide information campaign and really just make sure and run it over several weeks and make sure they understand that we are going to crack down on this thing and try to get it done. I saw this in play. I lived in Cave Creek, and back in the early 90s, I saw it work. They basically told the public what was going to happen. They put out the signs posting the decibel. The sheriffs enforced it, and it worked. We had a Harley problem out there. The Harleys come out to Cave Creek on the weekends, and they're very, very loud. But it did work, and they've stayed on it. And now, guess what? They found out they make a lot of money doing it, so they've kept it up. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Councilwoman Furworth.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree that, when we look at what we did with Prop 478, the public really did want traffic enforcement and safety. So that is there. But I do think the idea of periodic SWATs or being more organized, I do think I agree with some of the points that you both have brought up about the code, needs to be enhanced beyond tire squealing, and it needs to address the motorcycles and incorporate some of the state stuff. But I mean, all you have to do is go out on Nextdoor, and you can hear the people in the summer in the ranch neighborhood complaining about the motorcycles up and down, up and down, up and down all night long. We had a citizen literally send us an email. They could tell us the Ford model and license plate. I've got friends that are along Iron Spring. They can also report the exact cars, the exact license plates. So I think if we did some kind of a public safety campaign to the non-emergency number, because this is not an emergency, but if people could then report and know that eventually police, when they can fit it in between everything else, could, go have an engagement with that vehicle owner and let them know,
Yes.
There is a new sheriff and a new policy and code in town. And then I do think leading up to the summer concert series, really cracking down in the downtown area, because tourism is critical to this community, let alone how much we all love the summer concert series. But if this continues, because other communities are cracking down, they can't joyride in Cave Creek anymore. So where are they, where will they come and hurt our income? So I would like to see some focused area, especially when the community is out of their homes and starting to enjoy outside, that we make that focus. But again, I hear you. 478, we got to get the staffing up to support all of these things. So
Yes, ma'am.
this for me is like a start in fiscal year 26. Let's get the code done sooner than that. But once you get the staffing and the money starts rolling in April, then let's figure this out.
Councilmember Rusing.
Oh, I just wanted to finish off with maybe looking at Prescott Valley's code and see what they have, because I wonder if they have a very strict code and the riders are coming over here because they get ticketed in Prescott Valley.
Do we have any public comment?
We do, Mayor. Sherry Hanna?
Thank you, Chief.
You're welcome, Mayor.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Sherry Hanna, longtime resident. I live on Willow Creek Road, and there's a lot of drag racing on Willow Creek Road, especially during the summer months when it's light, and then usually it happens late in the evenings around 11, midnight, which starts the dogs barking, a whole chain of reaction. My dog barks, they all just go a chain of reaction, and the whole neighborhood's up. So I think education is great to let people know that, it doesn't always happen in the downtown area. It's on Willow Creek Road. That's a major thoroughfare for us now. And they speed up and down, not only with the mufflers, but the tires squealing and those types of things. So I think it's a good idea, education. I did, reach out about a year or so ago, and of course with our staffing of our law enforcement shortage, I understand that they couldn't be down there, but that's another area to watch. happens late at night in the summer months. So just keep an eye on that. Thank you.
That's all, Mayor.
Okay. City Manager?
Yeah, if I can just jump in real quick. I'm hearing some interest in updating the code and in working on enforcement. I think I've heard that from 3, and I just want to see if there's nodding heads on the rest of the council to confirm
Yes.
that's the direction.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we have a consensus agreement on that.
Great, thank you.
Thanks again, Deputy Chief Brambola. Okay, we'll move on to item D, presentation, discussion, and direction relating to city leases.
Okay. Thank you very much. So this is, I guess the long and the short of this is that there's more time needed to develop this policy as we've started to dig in on leases. And this came from a conversation we had in the fall. We found bits and pieces of policy and instruction kind of all over the place that we need to consolidate. But we had direction from the council to be here on this date for a conversation, and so we wanted to make sure we were following that direction. This is an opportunity for the council to provide any other thoughts or direction that you have on this topic. And then I'd ask for that direction to be that we continue working on this and bring a policy to you that you can approve at a future meeting.
Councilman Moore?
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Dallin, for seeking input from the council as far as direction. I think it's really important for our community, for us to make sure that when we have leases that they are market value, that the city is being compensated at a rate that is appropriate for the property that is being leased from the city, and that is consistent. That we don't favor one organization over another organization in the lease arrangements and the fees that we're charging, that we set a standard that's going to be consistent. I know it might take us a while to get there because some leases are locked in, but any new leases going forward, and as we renew leases, that we get market rate. The other comment I'd like to make is I think we should really take a serious look at the length of some of our leases. I don't think we should be entering into leases that are more than 15 to 20 years. I think we really need to renew them more frequently and update them because circumstances change, situations change, and some of our long-term leases aren't in our best interest and give us a black eye.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Dallin, yes, I agree with that too. It just makes good sense to be, good stewards of our taxpayer dollars. We should always be charging market rate, just always. I don't think we actually have any business reducing rates for any reason. This is being a good steward of the taxpayer dollars. And I do think every contract we have should be reviewed every 5 years, maybe sooner, and it needs to have an escalator clause in it. As the market goes up, it needs to escalate, and it can all be spelled out in the contract. Why we're favoring one citizen over the other 48,000 people is just beyond me. It should be always market rate. That's just good business. Thank you.
Councilmember Roosing?
Thank you. In principle, I agree. It makes sense to get market rate. But then, we have our leases for our nonprofits at the Rollie P. Simmons Community Center. There's 2 tenants, Meals on Wheels, and also the center. They provide a wonderful service to the community. They have $1 a year lease. I know for the center, I assume it's the same for Meals on Wheels, and I think we should carve out some exceptions, and because there's just no way that they could pay market rate. They're not for-profits, so maybe we should make a distinction between profit-oriented business, like hangars. Private pilots that keep jets at the hangars on the airport should pay market rate, but our nonprofits should get a special consideration because they do so much for the community.
Councilwoman Furworth?
Thank you, Mayor. When I was looking at all the pre-reading material, it just struck me again and again, whether it be about lessee background information. I was like, can't we benchmark with what other Arizona cities and towns are getting and doing with like kind of outfits, whether they be nonprofits, whether they be for-profits. I agree with all the points that Councilman Moore made. And the same thing for me goes with caretaker units. You know, again, let's benchmark. I understand the value of having people living on property. But we need some, clarity of the caretaker responsibilities with metrics that will be verified and audited to make sure properties are being kept up to standards. And so those are the kind of things I was amazed looking at some of the numbers that you had, where some were like so uniform. You could see there's a standard in place. And then other ones, I was like, what is this? Spin the wheel on what our parking rate structure will be today? Good news. You got the almost free version. So I just think that we need more standards, more market-based standards, and more documentation. I'm not the best person, but I could probably spend an hour out on websites and find some other cities that have, I look at Scottsdale, they've got some major facilities and things like that. So, we could go or get a public group form to help you go do all of that level of research and come back to you with come back to all of us, I should say, with a recommendation on the different types of leases. That's my thoughts.
Councilman Montoya.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with what a lot of what's been said already, although I will add, I don't have a problem with leasing to nonprofits below market value if we're quantifying what that value that they're bringing back to the community is. And so I think that's an important way to frame it. And I think in my conversations that I've had about this with the city manager, I think one of the things that comes to mind is you can set the rent at market rate, and then you can afford them the opportunity to apply for grants through the city so that there's a way to track to make sure that there is some community engagement with that piece, as opposed to just kind of giving people what I would refer to as a free ride. My concern when you artificially lower rent of a facility, one of two things can tend to happen, which is, one is that the person utilizing that property won't take very good care of it, which is a detriment to the city. Or the other side of it is they take a lot of ownership of it, and then when they get direction to the city to do something different, they bristle at that. And so I think that's not a great outcome either. So I think there's ways to do that, and my big direction would be for city manager and staff to kind of explore what those opportunities look at with the sensitivity to the nonprofits to realize that we do have a fiscal duty to our taxpayers to kind of have accountability there. And so that we're tracking and measuring that and can kind of go back to those folks. I think some of the recent controversies we've had around city property could be alleviated if we were just kind of quantifying the value back and forth and not just letting people get a free ride, so to speak. Thank you.
Councilman Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. Just one quick comment. I appreciate Lois bringing up the caretaker employee tenant situation. I think that should also be codified, that there's a clear understanding of how we select and how employees are chosen to live in these facilities rent-free. I think that's very important. We have a policy in place for that.
Well, I think I agree. I think there's a number of areas that I think the city manager would probably appreciate having some policy direction. When you look at the city charter, the city manager has the authority to negotiate leases. If we sell or dispose of property, we have to go out to high bidder. For many years, we had a big loophole when it came to lease purchases. And that's a situation that happened with the Hilton Garden Inn, where there was kind of a sweetheart deal on that lease purchase option for developing the Hilton Garden Inn. So I think we kind of directed and solved that with the charter amendments that we voted in a year or two ago. But I think maybe having some policy direction here, and I think you're right. I think having too long of length of leases sometimes can be and over that period of time, whether it's 20, 30, 40, some years, we have to recognize that the tenant may be putting in improvements and they need enough time to have a return on investment to be able to cover their costs as they improve the property. And like most leases, after it expires, the improvements then revert to the owner of the property, which would be the city. So that has to be taken into consideration. I think connecting it to some type of a CPI so that the lease rate can be modified when we have extreme inflationary environments, which we've experienced over the last few years in the nation, is also a good idea. But I think we have so many nonprofits in the community that really do great work for the community at large and provide a lot of benefits. So I think requiring that someone who wants to get a below market rate because they are a nonprofit, if they could submit their 990 IRS performance to support their claim, that in order for them to continue to do good in the community, they need some consideration on the lease costs. That's a reasonable way of determining whether those claims are really legitimate. And then they could be required to resubmit that maybe every couple of years to make sure that they're continuing to operate in an ethical and effective way. And I think really targeting a market rate directly to the more commercial types of leases that we would be considering would put together a pretty good policy for your consideration when you're negotiating those leases. Do we have any comments from the city manager or the public?
I don't have any public comment cards, no.
I would just say thank you. I think that gives that's kind of the direction we were headed. That'll allow us to consolidate and then build and come back with a policy for the council to approve that will direct all of our leases citywide versus some of our stuff has been more departmental at this point. So it'll be a good move for us.
Good. Any other comments or concerns from the council? Gee, I think I'm 3 minutes ahead of schedule. When does that ever happen? Happens today. Well, I think sometimes giving maybe some advance guidance helps us to stay on track. So with that said, this is our session is now adjourned, and we'll reconvene at 3 o'clock for our voting meeting.